The shot was the first thing Jackson Cole heard, a dry crack that split the morning stillness of Dry Creek. It wasn't the sound of a hunter's rifle, distant and muffled by the plains. This was close. It was the sound of iron barking on Main Street, a sound he had spent 10 years trying to forget. He was inside the Dry Creek Bank and Trust, the polished wood floor gleaming under the high windows, the air smelling of ink and old money. Across the counter, the teller, a young man named Peterson with spectacles perched on his nose, was mid-sentence about the unusually dry season. Then the world exploded. The bank's double doors flew open with a crash that sent splinters of wood flying. 3 men stormed in their faces, obscured by dusty red bandanas. They moved with the brutal efficiency of wolves, one man leveling a shotgun at the 2 other customers, a rancher and his wife, forcing them to the floor. Another vaulted the counter, his boots thudding on the wood as he shoved Peterson against the wall. But it was the 3rd man, the leader, who commanded the room. He was taller than the others, with a cruel confidence in his stride. He wore a dark duster that billowed around him, and the Colt peacemaker in his hand seemed like a natural extension of his arm. "Morning, folks," the leader drawled, his voice a low rumble that carried an unnerving charisma. "Just a simple withdrawal. No heroes today, please. It gets so messy." Jackson's hand twitched, his instincts screaming for the Colt he no longer carried at his hip. 10 years as a Texas Ranger had forged reflexes in him that a quiet life on a ranch couldn't erase. He saw the angles, the vulnerabilities. The man at the counter was exposed. The one with the shotgun was focused on the couple. But the leader, his eyes a piercing cold blue above the bandana, swept the room and landed on Jackson. They held no fear, only a predatory focus that made the hairs on Jackson's neck stand up. Jackson stood perfectly still, his hands raised slightly in a gesture of surrender. He was just a rancher now, a father. He had promised his late wife Sarah he was done with this life. He had promised his daughter Molly a world without gunfire. "You," the leader said, his gaze fixed on Jackson. "Empty your pockets. Slow." Jackson did as he was told, pulling out a few folded bills and a handful of coins. He placed them on the floor. The leader's eyes narrowed, not looking at the money, but at something else. A thin silver chain around Jackson's neck. "The locket," the man commanded. A cold dread, sharp and suffocating, washed over Jackson. He could lose the money, the bank's money, his pride. But not that. The locket was a simple silver oval worn smooth by his thumb over the years. Inside was a tiny faded portrait of Sarah, her smile as bright as a summer morning. It was all he had left of her face. "It's nothing," Jackson said, his voice low and steady, a dangerous calm settling over him. "Just a keepsake." The leader took a step closer, the barrel of his Colt unwavering. "I decide what's nothing. Take it off." Jackson didn't move. Every fiber of his being rebelled. It was more than a piece of silver. It was a promise, a memory, the last tangible piece of a life that had been stolen from him. The man with the shotgun glanced over, sensing the shift in the air. The tension in the room stretched thin, ready to snap. With a sigh of theatrical impatience, the leader strode forward. He didn't bother waiting. He reached out his gloved fingers, hooking the chain, and ripped it from Jackson's neck. The delicate links bit into Jackson's skin before snapping. The man held the locket up, letting it swing in the dusty light. He didn't even open it. He just smiled, a cruel curl of his lips visible above the bandana. Silas, the man at the counter, hissed, stuffing canvas bags with cash. "We got what we came for." The leader, Silas, pocketed the locket without another glance at Jackson. "Patience, brother. Sometimes it's the little things that make a day worthwhile." He backed toward the door, his men following, their bags heavy. "Been a pleasure doing business with you, Dry Creek." They were gone as quickly as they came, leaving behind a shattered door, terrified silence, and a gaping hole in Jackson's chest. The rancher's wife was sobbing into her husband's shoulder. Peterson was slumped against the wall, shaking. But Jackson didn't see them. He saw only the empty space where the locket used to be the place over his heart that now felt impossibly cold. The robbery wasn't just about money. For him, it had been a violation, a deliberate act of cruelty. Silas Crane had not just stolen a piece of silver. He had stolen a ghost. And in that moment, Jackson Cole knew the quiet life he had tried to build was over. The ride back to the ranch was a long, silent journey through a world painted in shades of rust and gold. The red sand glowed like embers under the unforgiving sun, and the vast, lonely landscape stretched to a horizon that promised nothing but more of the same. The silence of the plains, usually a comfort, was broken only by the mournful cry of a hawk circling high above a lonely sentinel in an empty sky. For Jackson, the emptiness felt different today. It felt personal. His ranch was nestled in a small, defensible valley, a patch of grudgingly fertile land he had bought cheap and worked until his hands were permanently calloused. It was a place of solitude, a fortress against the world he had left behind. But as he rode up the familiar path, the two-story clapboard house looked fragile, the fences like flimsy suggestions rather than barriers. A small figure in a faded blue dress burst from the front door, her golden curls bouncing. Daddy Molly cried, her 4-year-old legs churning through the dust. Jackson swung down from his horse and caught her in a one-armed hug, the motion automatic, but his heart felt like a lead weight in his chest. Molly was the spitting image of Sarah, from her bright, curious eyes to the stubborn set of her small chin. She was a living, breathing reminder of everything he had lost, and the only reason he had to keep going. "Did you get the candy?" she asked, her voice muffled against his shirt. "They were all out, darling," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. Her face fell a small cloud, passing over her sunny disposition. He felt a pang of guilt. Their relationship was tender, forged in the shared sorrow of Sarah's passing, but it was strained. He loved her more than life itself, but he was a man built for action, not gentle words, and his grief often manifested as a gruff distance he didn't know how to bridge. "Gus is fixing the pump," Molly offered, trying to fill the silence. "He said the devil himself must have put a hex on it." From the barn, a wiry figure emerged, wiping grease from his hands with a rag. Gus was as weathered as the land itself, his face a road map of wrinkles, his eyes squinting from a lifetime under the Arizona sun. He had been with the ranch longer than Jackson, a fixture who offered quiet wisdom and unwavering loyalty. "Heard the commotion in town." Gus said, his voice like gravel. He didn't ask for details. He just watched Jackson, his gaze knowing. "You all right, Jackson?" Jackson just nodded, unsaddling his horse with sharp, angry movements. They took the bank. Got away clean. He didn't mention the locket. It was a private wound too deep to be spoken aloud. Gus saw the red mark on his neck where the chain had been. He saw the new hard set to Jackson's jaw. He didn't press. "Supper will be ready soon," was all he said before turning back to the barn. That night, Jackson sat on the porch long after Molly was asleep. The stars blazed in the ink-black sky, cold and distant. He ran his thumb over the empty spot on his chest, a phantom limb he couldn't stop reaching for. Silas Crane. The name was a brand on his mind. This wasn't a random act of violence. It felt like a message, a cruel reminder that no matter how far he ran, the world he came from could always reach out and take what was his. He was a good man, a man who had put down his guns for the sake of his daughter. But as he stared out at the dark, silent plains, he felt the ghost of the Texas Ranger stirring within him. He was haunted by his past, and now he was being hunted by it. He had to protect the little he had left, and he knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that it would require more than just fences. A week later, the dust of the robbery had settled, but the unease in Dry Creek remained. It clung to the air like the heat, a low hum of fear and suspicion. Jackson needed supplies, and he couldn't put off the trip any longer. He took Molly with him, the familiar weight of her small hand in his, a fragile anchor in a world that felt increasingly unsteady. He was still brooding the theft of the locket, a constant dull ache behind his ribs. The livestock market pulsed with its usual chaotic energy, the shouts of traders, the bellowing of cattle, the sharp smell of sweat and dung. Jackson moved through the crowd with purpose, his eyes scanning his senses on high alert. Molly skipped beside him, her earlier excitement about seeing the ponies now tempered by her father's grim mood. "Daddy, can we see the ponies?" after she chirped, trying to break his silence. "We will, darling. Just need to check on the hay first." But before they reached the stalls, Molly stopped dead. Her hands, slick with nervous sweat, tightened around his. "What is it?" Jackson asked, crouching to her level. She didn't speak. She just pointed with a trembling finger. At the far edge of the market, tied to a thick wooden post next to a pen of scrawny mules, was a woman. She was chained like an animal, heavy iron shackles binding her wrists and ankles to the splintered wood. She was barefoot, her dress a filthy collection of rags, her face a canvas of bruises and dried blood. A curtain of matted dark hair hid most of her features, but Jackson could see the way her shoulders slumped in utter defeat. People passed by without a second glance. She was an object, a piece of unfortunate property, not even worth a whisper. Jackson's chest tightened. It was the casual cruelty of it that struck him, the complete indifference of the world to her suffering. Daddy Molly's voice was a small, fragile thing. "Is she dying?" He looked closer. Her chest rose and fell in shallow, almost imperceptible movements. She was alive, but only just. He felt a surge of cold fury, the same helpless anger he'd felt on the floor of the bank. Here was another person trapped, powerless, discarded. A greasy trader with a stained hat noticed Jackson staring and sauntered over. "Take a good look. Last of her line." "She yours?" Jackson asked, his voice low and hard. The man shrugged, spitting a stream of tobacco juice near Jackson's boots. "Was her brother's. Owed me more than he could pay. She's what's left of the debt. Barely breathing, but the bonds are solid iron. Ain't worth much now." Jackson's gaze was fixed on the woman. He saw a flicker of movement under the curtain of her hair. Her head lifted just an inch, and for a split second her eyes met his. They were sunken and clouded with pain. But in their depths he saw a spark. It wasn't hope. It was a flicker of defiant fire, a refusal to be extinguished completely. It was a look he recognized. It was the same fire Sarah had possessed, a strength that had burned bright, even at the very end. He started to turn away, to pull Molly toward the ponies and leave this ugliness behind. It wasn't his business. He had enough of his own ghosts to fight. But Molly didn't move. "Daddy, she's hurt," she said, her voice trembling but firm. She tugged harder on his hand. "We got to help her." He looked down at his daughter's eyes, clear and pleading, filled with a fierce compassion he thought the world had beaten out of him. In her face, he saw his wife's legacy, not just her features, but her spirit. "Please," Molly whispered. He hesitated. He had no space for this. No reason, no time. He was a man trying to disappear, not collect more broken things. But as he looked from Molly's determined face to the woman in chains, something shifted inside him. He remembered the feeling of Silas Crane's fingers on his neck, the cold emptiness that followed. He had been powerless then, but not now. This was a small, tangible thing. an act of redemption he could hold in his hands. He turned back to the trader, his expression grim. "How much?" The trader blinked, surprised. "You serious, mister?" "How much to unchain her and get her on my horse?" Jackson's voice was clipped, leaving no room for negotiation. The man's eyes gleamed with avarice. $10. "5," Jackson countered flatly. The trader sized him up, saw the unyielding set of his jaw, and spat again. "5 it is." Jackson reached into his coat and counted out the coins. The trader snatched them from his palm and unlocked the shackles. The moment the iron fell away, the woman crumpled like a rag doll, her body giving out completely. Jackson caught her before she hit the dust, her weight almost nothing in his arms. She was feverish, her skin burning even through the tattered cloth of her dress. Molly stood nearby, her small hands clenched into fists. "What's her name?" Jackson asked the trader, lifting the woman onto his horse and settling in the saddle behind her, her body sagging against his chest. "Didn't give one, didn't ask." The trader was already walking away, counting his coins. They rode out of Dry Creek as the sun began to dip low, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. A man, a child, and a woman, no one wanted. The woman hadn't stirred her head, lolling against his shoulder. He could feel the fragile beat of her heart against his own. He was a man running from a fight, yet here he was, carrying another battle home. Eliza's first awareness was of pain, a deep resonant ache that lived in her bones. Her second was of softness, not the hard-packed dirt or splintered wood she had grown accustomed to, but a thin mattress and a coarse wool blanket. She opened her eyes slowly, her lids as heavy as stones. The ceiling above her was made of rough wooden beams. Sunlight, thin and pale, seeped through the cracks of a boarded-up window. The air smelled of pine-old dust and something medicinal. A soft sound drew her attention, small feet taking careful steps. A little girl stood in the doorway, holding a wooden bowl with both hands. Steam curled from its surface. "I brought you some porridge," the girl said, her voice small but sure. Eliza didn't answer. She tracked the child's movements with the primal wariness of an injured animal, too weak to flee, too broken to trust. The girl stepped closer, her expression open and unafraid, and set the bowl on a small crate beside the cot. "It's not too hot." I waited. Still, Eliza said nothing. Her throat was a raw, dry canyon. She waited until the child had tiptoed out of the room before her trembling fingers reached for the bowl. The porridge was warm, and she ate it slowly, each spoonful a monumental effort. Jackson had placed her in the old storage room off the barn. He'd swept it clean, brought in the cot, a chair, and a pitcher of fresh water. It wasn't a bedroom. It was a cage without a lock. For now, that was more than she could have hoped for. The days that followed were a blur of fevered sleep and quiet observation. The man Jackson was a silent, brooding presence. He would leave food by the door and check on her from a distance, his face a mask of grim obligation. He never tried to speak to her beyond a few gruff questions about her pain. He was a man doing what he believed was right, nothing more. But the child Molly was different. She was a persistent ray of sunshine in Eliza's gray world. She would sit just inside the doorway, chattering about her day, about the chickens, about a funny-shaped cloud. She didn't demand answers. She just filled the silence. Molly had started calling her Miss E because, as she explained, Eliza is too long to say when you're in a hurry. Eliza didn't have the strength or the will to correct her. As the fever receded, leaving her weak but lucid, Eliza began to move. She swept the porch steps without being asked. She used a needle and thread she found in a forgotten sewing box to mend a tear in Molly's dress, her hands remembering the stitches better than her mind remembered peace. She was a ghost, haunting the edges of their lives, a stranger who moved with the quiet efficiency of someone who had once belonged somewhere. The town, however, did not forget where she came from. On a trip to the general store for supplies, the whispers followed her like flies. "That's Jackson Cole's purchase," a woman muttered to her friend, her eyes sharp and judgmental. "Heard he keeps her in the barn," another sneered. "Bought but not for work, if you take my meaning." Widow Thompson, a formidable woman whose pronouncements were treated as gospel in Dry Creek, watched Eliza from behind the counter, her arms crossed. A man brings a stray dog home, folks call him kind. He brings home a stray woman, they call him a fool. Or worse. Eliza kept her head down, her face impassive. She had heard worse. She had lived worse. Their words were just stones thrown into a river of pain that already ran too deep to feel them land. The fragile truce at the ranch was shattered late one afternoon. Jackson was repairing a fence at the far end of the pasture. Eliza was gathering wild herbs near the creek bed, her movements still slow and careful. Molly, chasing butterflies, had wandered too close to a rocky outcrop. The scream was pure terror. "Daddy." Jackson dropped his hammer and ran, his heart seizing in his chest. He saw it before he reached her, a diamondback rattlesnake coiled and ready to strike again, its rattle a furious, deadly buzz. But he also saw Eliza. She had moved faster than he would have thought possible. She threw herself between the snake and the child, not with a stick or a rock, but with her body. As the snake lunged, she thrust her hand out, grabbing it behind the head, its fangs sinking deep into her forearm. She didn't cry out. A sharp hiss of pain escaped her gritted teeth as she flung the venomous creature into the brush with a violent snap of her wrist. Jackson swept Molly into one arm and grabbed Eliza with the other, his mind racing. He half-dragged, half-carried Eliza back to the house, her face already pale, a dark stain of blood spreading from the two small punctures in her arm. He laid her on the kitchen table, his hands working with a desperate urgency. He sliced the wound open with his knife, sucking out the venom and spitting it onto the floor. He crushed herbs into a poultice, his movements sure and steady despite the frantic pounding in his chest. Eliza drifted in and out of consciousness, her body trembling. Near dawn, as the first gray light touched the windows, her eyes fluttered open. They were wild with fever, seeing not the kitchen, but some darker place from her past. "Please," she murmured, her voice cracked and raw. "Please, don't chain me again." Jackson froze, the damp cloth in his hand, paused above her forehead. He had heard her speak, but never like this, never with such raw, gut-wrenching terror. He reached for her hand, the one not swollen from the bite. It was cold and damp with sweat. "No one's chaining you, Eliza," he said, his voice quiet but firm in the stillness of the room. "Not ever again." Her eyes slipped closed once more, but her breathing seemed to ease slightly. Jackson didn't leave. He sat beside her as the sun rose, watching the steady rise and fall of her chest. When Molly crept into the room wrapped in her morning blanket, she found her father still there, holding the hand of the woman who had saved her life, a silent vigil against the ghosts that haunted them all. By the time the swelling in Eliza's arm faded to a bruised purple, and the color returned to her cheeks, autumn had begun to paint the desert hills in strokes of gold and crimson. A fragile peace had settled over the ranch, but Eliza knew it was borrowed time. She stood in the storage room, her back to the door, packing the few items she now possessed, a mended dress, a worn primer book, into a small cloth bundle. "I can't stay," she said, her voice even betraying none of the turmoil inside her. Jackson leaned against the doorframe, his broad shoulders filling the space. His arms were folded, his expression unreadable. "You don't owe us anything, Eliza. You saved my daughter." He reached into his coat pocket and held out a small cloth pouch. Inside was a handful of coins. "This will get you as far as Santa Fe. Maybe further if you travel light." She took it without a word, her fingers trembling slightly as they brushed his. The finality of the gesture felt like a closing door. "You can't go," a small voice cried out. Molly, who had overheard, burst into the room, her face streaked with tears. She rushed to Eliza, clutching at her skirt with desperate little hands. "You saved me. You live here now." Eliza knelt, her movements fluid and graceful, and smoothed the child's tangled hair. The ache in her chest was a physical thing. "You're safe now, little one. That's what matters." "No," Molly sobbed, burying her face in Eliza's shoulder. "I want you." Jackson watched, his jaw clenched so tightly a muscle jumped. He was a man who solved problems with fences and firearms, not with feelings. But the sight of his daughter clinging to this broken woman, this stranger who had become her protector, cracked something open in him. Finally, he spoke, his voice gruff, to hide the uncertainty beneath. "You could stay on. As help. I mean, paid work." He cleared his throat, avoiding Eliza's gaze. "Molly, clearly. She likes you, and the place could use another hand." Eliza hesitated, her eyes searching his face for pity, for charity. She found neither. She saw only a man grappling with a situation he didn't understand, offering the only solution he knew. She looked down at Molly, whose tear-filled eyes were fixed on her. Then, with a soft, almost imperceptible nod, she whispered, "I'll earn my keep." Life on the ranch found a new rhythm. Eliza rose before dawn, her hands tireless. She gathered eggs, fed the horses, swept the porch, repaired the broken hinges on the stable doors. She worked with a quiet determination, as if trying to physically rebuild a life from the wreckage of her past. The ranch under her care began to look more alive than it had since Sarah's passing. And everywhere Eliza went, Molly followed a small, devoted shadow. One morning, as Eliza showed her how to plant winter herbs in a small patch of garden she had tilled herself, Molly looked up, her face serious. "I think you're my new mama now." Eliza froze, her fingers buried deep in the cool soil. Jackson, who had just stepped onto the porch with his morning coffee, heard it too. He stood there for a long moment, a statue silhouetted against the rising sun, before turning and walking back into the house without a word. Eliza wiped her hands on her apron, blinking against a sudden sting in her eyes. "Let's finish planting," she whispered to Molly, her voice thick. A few days later, Jackson returned from a trip to town with a small wooden box wrapped in cloth. He found Eliza folding laundry in the back room. "This is for you," he said, setting it on the table. She eyed it with suspicion before unwrapping the cloth. Inside lay a dress of pale blue cotton, simple but new. Beneath it was a small engraved tag on a leather strap. It read, "Miss Eliza." She stared at it, unable to speak. Jackson cleared his throat, his gaze fixed on a point somewhere over her shoulder. Molly picked the color. Said it looked like the sky right before the stars come out. Eliza's throat tightened. She closed the box gently. For the first time since she had arrived, her voice was not clipped or wary. It was soft, fragile. "Thank you, Jackson." He gave a small nod, turned, and walked out. That night, as the fire crackled low, Eliza stood before the small, cracked mirror in her room. The pale blue dress was soft beneath her fingers. For the first time in a lifetime, the reflection staring back at her looked like someone who had a name. And for the first time, she dared to wonder if it was a name she could keep. The morning fog rolled low across the valley, shrouding the ranch in a veil of silver mist. A restless energy had kept Eliza from sleep, a sense of impending change that hummed just beneath the quiet surface of her new life. It pulled her toward the old storage shed at the back of the property, a place filled with forgotten tools and memories Jackson didn't dare confront. While sweeping the far corner, her broom snagged on a warped floorboard. It was loose. A flicker of curiosity, an emotion she hadn't felt in years, prompted her to kneel and pry it up with her fingers. Beneath it, wrapped in layers of brittle yellowed cloth, lay a flat oilskin bundle. It smelled of dust and time and loss. With cautious hands, she untied the string and unfolded the cloth. Inside were faded letters tied with a ribbon, an official-looking land deed, and a hand-drawn map. The paper crackled as she carefully unrolled the deed. The wax seal was broken, but the elegant script was clear. Crane Homestead, 1861. The name hit her like a physical blow. Crane, her name. The fog in her mind, the thick protective barrier she had built around her past, suddenly cleared. Memories sharp and violent rushed in like a flood. She saw a cabin, smelled the smoke of a pine fire. She saw her mother's face humming a lullaby as she planted lavender by the door. She saw her older brother Simon, tall and protective, teaching her how to track rabbits. And then she saw the fire. Raiders in the night, their faces illuminated by the flames that licked at the walls of their home. Her mother's scream, a sound that had been the soundtrack to every nightmare. Simon, just a boy himself, dragging her into the woods, his hand clamped over her mouth to stifle her cries. When they returned, the cabin was a skeleton of blackened timber. Their mother was gone. The land, their legacy, was stolen. The name on the deed belonged to the man who had bought it at auction for a pittance, the same man Jackson had later purchased it from. This wasn't just Jackson's ranch. This land, this very dirt beneath her feet, was her birthright. Fearing the connection, fearing the hope and the danger it represented, she quickly rewrapped the bundle and hid it away. On the loose floorboard, a silent guardian of her secret. The knowledge was a heavy weight, a truth that could either anchor her or drown her. Jackson, meanwhile, was consumed by a different ghost. Driven by the theft of his wife's locket, he had begun a quiet investigation into Silas Crane and his gang. He rode to neighboring towns, speaking to sheriffs and marshals, piecing together the outlaws' movements. He learned they weren't just hitting banks. They were targeting isolated homesteads, ranches like his own, seemingly at random. They took what they could, but witnesses always reported the leader, Silas, seemed to be searching for something specific, an old map, some said. A deed, said others. Miles away in a hidden canyon camp, Silas Crane Simon unrolled a tattered hand-drawn map on a crate. It was a copy of the one his father had made, the one that showed the location of a hidden spring on their land. A secret that made the arid property invaluable. He had spent years searching for the original deed and the map, believing they were the key to reclaiming his past. The fire had taken everything, including, he thought, his little sister. Grief had festered into a cold, hard rage. He had sold himself into indentured servitude on a railroad crew to survive a brutal existence that had hammered the softness out of him and forged him into the ruthless outlaw he was today. He was no longer a boy named Simon. He was Silas Crane, a man fueled by vengeance, convinced that the world only respected power. He believed a squatter was living on his family's land, and he intended to burn him out, just as he believed his family had been burned out before. The locket he'd stolen from the man in the bank was just a petty cruelty, a way to inflict a small measure of the powerlessness he felt. He didn't know its significance, but he knew the man's face. He was the one the county records listed as the current owner of the Crane homestead. Eliza, haunted by her discovery, found herself drawn to the past. She began to have recurring nightmares of the fire, of searching for a small wooden box her father had buried near a cluster of cedar trees. His legacy, he had called it. One afternoon, guided by the phantom memory, she took a spade and began to dig at the spot. Molly, ever present, skipped over. "Can I help, Miss E?" Eliza nodded, handing her a small trowel. Together, their hands in the dirt, they worked. Soon the spade hit something solid, splinters of old wood. Eliza brushed away the soil, her fingers trembling as she pried open the rotted lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was a silver necklace tarnished with age. Next to it was a photograph ripped at the edge of a woman and two small children, herself and Simon standing beside their mother. The tag on the necklace was engraved, Eliza Zhang Si. Jackson found them there, crouched in the dirt, their hands soiled. He froze when he saw the open box, the raw emotion on Eliza's face. "In God's name, what are you doing?" His voice was sharper than he intended, the voice of a landowner wary of trespassers. Eliza stood slowly, clutching the necklace. "This land, it used to be ours. This was my family's." His jaw tightened. Suspicion, an old and familiar reflex, clouded his features. "You're digging holes behind my barn without a word. What was I supposed to think? That I was stealing?" Her voice broke the accusation, stinging more than any whip. "That I was running away again?" His silence was her answer. She looked away, her fists clenched at her sides. "You still don't trust me." He took a step forward, his expression softening with regret. "Eliza." "No," she said, hot tears finally spilling down her cheeks. "You think I was born in chains. But I wasn't. My father was a homesteader. My mother sang in the church choir. I wasn't always this." "Then why didn't you say anything?" He asked, his voice gentle now. "Because it didn't matter," she whispered fiercely. "It didn't matter when I was bleeding in the street. It didn't matter when my own brother sold me to pay a gambling debt. He told me I was better off in chains than dead. For a long time I believed him." Molly looked between them, her small face etched with confusion. Jackson knelt beside Eliza. He picked up the tarnished necklace from the dirt, rubbing the silver with his thumb until it shone faintly. He was wrong. She looked up at him, her breath catching in her throat. He gently fastened the chain around her neck, the cool metal a stark contrast to her warm skin. The pendant rested just above her heart. "You're not what happened to you, Eliza," he said, his voice low but steady. "You're who you choose to be. Right here. With us." She closed her eyes, the tears falling silently now. The weight of the necklace felt like an anchor, not a chain. And for the first time since the fire, she believed she might not be lost after all. The interrogation took place in Jackson's barn, and the air thick with the scent of hay and horsehide. The captured outlaw, a scrawny kid named Billy, was tied to a support beam, his face a mask of bravado that was quickly cracking. Jackson's questioning was patient, relentless, and backed by the silent authority of a man who knew exactly how to dismantle another man's will. "We know you've been hitting homesteads," Jackson said, circling the boy slowly. "But you're not taking livestock. You're not taking valuables. You're turning places upside down. What is Silas looking for?" Billy spat on the dirt floor. "Wouldn't tell you if I knew." Jackson stopped in front of him, his shadow falling over the boy. "Your leader took something from me. Something personal. So this is personal now. You can either talk to me, or you can take your chances with the federal marshal I'm sending for." The boy's eyes flickered with fear. The marshals had a reputation for not bringing men like him back alive. "He's just looking for what's his," Billy mumbled. "What's his?" "Land," the boy said, his voice gaining a bit of strength. "This whole damn valley. It was his family's place. The Crane homestead. Stolen from him years ago by some land-grabbing swindler." Jackson went still. The name echoed Eliza's words, the name on the deed she had found. Crane. Silas Crane claims this land, Excrement asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Billy laughed, a short, bitter sound. His name ain't Silas. That's just a name he picked up. His real name is Simon. Simon Crane. He leaned forward, his eyes wide with the weight of the story he was telling. He's been looking for it for years. And for something else. Someone else. A cold premonition washed over Jackson. He felt the ground shifting beneath his feet. Who? The outlaw looked up, a strange mix of pity and awe in his expression. His sister, a little girl named Eliza. He thinks she died in the fire that took their home. Swears he's gonna burn the man living on his land to the ground just for vengeance. For her. The world narrowed to a single roaring point in Jackson's mind. Eliza. The woman he had saved, the woman who had saved his daughter. The woman who was at this very moment in his kitchen, humming a tune as she baked bread, was the sister of the ruthless outlaw he was hunting. The man who had ripped his wife's memory from his neck. The entire conflict, which he had seen as a simple matter of justice and revenge, was now a tangled, horrifying knot of family grief and stolen history. Silas Simon was not just a random villain terrorizing the territory. He was Eliza's long-lost brother, a man twisted by a grief so profound it had turned him into a monster, and he was coming for them. He was coming for the man he believed was a squatter, never imagining he would find the sister he was trying to avenge. Jackson stumbled out of the barn into the harsh sunlight, his mind reeling. He looked toward the house, toward the plume of smoke rising from the chimney. Eliza was in there, safe for now, completely unaware that the brother she thought had abandoned her was a breath away from destroying everything she had started to rebuild. The weight of the secret was crushing. He was standing on her land, protecting her from her own blood. The irony was so bitter, it tasted like ash in his mouth. 2 days later, a fine, polished carriage utterly out of place against the rugged landscape rolled up the path to the ranch. It was drawn by 2 bay horses with silver-stamped bridles, and the dust it kicked up seemed finer, more civilized than the common dirt of the valley. A woman stepped down, her gloved hand, extended before her boot even touched the ground. She wore a pale cream dress of city silk and a hat with a single, elegant feather. Jackson, who had been watching from the porch, felt his stomach clench. He didn't have to see her face to know who it was. Jackson, she called, her voice smooth and familiar, carrying a confidence that could bend the world to her will. You're looking well. Rustic. Clara Winthrop was not a ghost from his past. She was a meticulously preserved portrait. They had been engaged once a lifetime ago, a match of convenience between 2 prominent families. After Sarah's death, Clara had offered condolences that felt more like a business proposition. Now a wealthy widow herself, she had returned. But this was not a social call. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. Over a glass of cool water at the kitchen table, a space Eliza silently vacated, Clara spread a series of official-looking maps before him. The Transcontinental Railroad is expanding its southern line. She said, her red-lacquered fingernail tracing a path directly through Jackson's Valley. They've empowered me to acquire the necessary properties. Your ranch, Jackson, is the key. That spring of yours makes it the only viable location for a water depot for 50 miles. She named a price that made Jackson's breath catch. It was more money than he could make in 10 lifetimes of ranching. It was enough to move anywhere to give Molly a life of comfort and safety far from the shadows of Silas Crane. The company is prepared to be very generous. Clara said, her smile shrewd. This is your chance to leave all this behind. A fresh start. Jackson stared at the map, but he wasn't seeing the proposed rail line. He was seeing Eliza's face. He was standing on her land, the Crane homestead. He couldn't sell what wasn't his. But he couldn't explain why, without revealing Eliza's identity, without putting her directly in the path of her dangerous, vengeful brother. He was trapped between two forces, the relentless legal march of progress represented by Clara, and the violent, chaotic past embodied by Simon. Eliza, who had been in the next room mending one of Molly's dresses, overheard everything. Her hands went still, the needle frozen in the cloth. "Sell the ranch." The words struck her with the force of a physical blow. This place, which she now knew was her home by birthright, was being threatened. She was caught in her own impossible dilemma. If she spoke up and claimed the land using the deed hidden in the shed as proof, she would be asserting her identity as Eliza Crane. Simon would find her. The news would travel. He would come, and his violence would rain down on this small family that had given her sanctuary. But if she remained silent, Jackson would be forced to sell. He would lose everything, and they would all be cast out adrift once more. That evening, the tension in the house was a palpable thing. They ate supper in silence, Molly sensing the unspoken conflict between the adults. Later, Jackson found Eliza by the lavender patch she had so carefully cultivated. The purple blooms were fragrant in the cool night air. "It's a good offer," he said, not looking at her. "Enough to start over somewhere else, somewhere safe." Her back was to him. "Is that what you want, to start over?" Her voice was quiet, laced with an emotion he couldn't quite place. "I want to keep Molly safe." He answered the words feeling hollow, even to him. Eliza finally turned to face him, her eyes dark and searching in the moonlight. "This is your home, Jackson. You built it. But it's more than just land, isn't it?" Their dialogue was a minefield of subtext, of unspoken fears and impossible choices. He wanted to tell her everything about Simon, about her past and his own colliding. She wanted to tell him about the deed, about the name Crane, about the ground beneath their feet being her own flesh and blood. But the secrets held them in place, building a strange and powerful intimacy between them. They were bound not just by affection, but by a shared crisis, and their fates intertwined by the land and the ghosts that haunted it. He couldn't sell, she couldn't speak. They were trapped together. The storm arrived without warning, a monstrous wall of sand and dust that blotted out the sun and turned the afternoon sky to a bruised, angry twilight. The wind howled like a banshee, ripping at the shingles on the roof and shrieking through the cracks in the walls. It was the kind of storm that erased the world, leaving only the immediate, terrifying present. And in the heart of that chaos, they came. Silas Crane Simon had used the storm as cover. He and his men rode out of the swirling dust like apparitions, their forms hazy and distorted by the wind. Simon had no intention of a parley. He believed the man on his land was a squatter, a thief who had profited from his family's ruin. He was here to enact the only justice he understood: fire and retribution. The first gunshot was nearly lost in the wind's roar. It shattered the kitchen window, sending glass and splinters across the floor where Molly had been playing. Jackson reacted instantly, the instincts of the ranger taking over. "Eliza, get Molly to the root cellar, now." He grabbed the Winchester from its rack above the fireplace, his movements economical and deadly. He didn't have to tell her twice. Eliza swept Molly into her arms and ran for the heavy cellar door, her heart hammering against her ribs. The fight was brutal and disorienting. Jackson fired from the windows, using the sturdy log walls of the house for cover. The outlaws, blinded by the sand and exposed, were at a disadvantage. Between gusts of wind, an eerie silence would fall, punctuated only by the sharp crack of a rifle and the whine of a ricocheting bullet. Jackson moved through the house like a phantom, a grim defender of his small kingdom. Outside, Simon grew frustrated. This was not the easy fight he had anticipated. The man inside was no simple farmer. He fought with discipline, with tactics. During a lull in the wind, Simon crept toward the house, using the water trough for cover. He peered through a broken window pane, and for a moment the swirling dust cleared. He saw his target's face. It was the man from the bank, the man whose locket he still carried in his pocket. At that same moment, a floorboard creaked above them. Eliza, having secured Molly in the cellar, had crept upstairs to the bedroom, grabbing the old shotgun Jackson kept there. She couldn't just hide. This was her fight too. She appeared at the top of the stairs just as Simon burst through the front door, his Colt raised. He froze. The world seemed to stop. The howling wind, the gunfire, the fear, it all faded away. He was looking at a ghost. Her face was thinner, etched with hardship he couldn't imagine. But it was her. The same dark eyes, the same stubborn set of her jaw. It was Eliza. "You're alive?" He breathed the words stolen by the wind. Eliza stood motionless, the heavy shotgun in her hands. This was her brother. The boy who had protected her, the man who had sold her. His face was harder, crueler, but his eyes... Behind the cold fury, she saw the same flicker of haunted grief she saw in her own reflection. Jackson, seeing Simon's attention fixed on Eliza, saw his chance. He raised his Winchester. "Simon, don't!" Eliza cried out. The name spoken in her voice broke the spell. Simon's head whipped back toward Jackson, his expression a maelstrom of confusion, shock, and rage. "You know him," Jackson demanded, his aim unwavering. "He's my brother." Before Jackson could process it, Simon lunged not at him, but toward Eliza. "I didn't leave you to die." He roared the words, a raw, agonizing confession. The fire. It wasn't raiders. It was him. The man who stole our land. He said it to drive us out to get the deed. I thought you were dead. I saw them carry your body out. The secondary twist hit them all with the force of a physical blow. He hadn't abandoned her. He had been tricked. The body he saw must have been their mother's. He had spent his entire life believing his sister was dead, his grief and rage directed at a phantom enemy, while the real villain had walked away, clean selling the land to an unsuspecting buyer, the same man Jackson had bought it from years later. Simon, a boy left with nothing, had sold himself into indentured servitude just to survive the cruelty of that life, shaping him into the outlaw he was now. His entire campaign of vengeance was built on a foundation of lies and a desperate, misguided love for the sister he thought he had lost. The moment of revelation was shattered by a shout from outside. One of the remaining outlaws, seeing his leader cornered, opened fire. The bullets chewed through the wooden doorframe. In that instant, Eliza made her choice. She stepped forward, placing herself directly between the barrel of Jackson's rifle and her brother's heart. She was no longer a victim of her past. She was the master of her present. She stood between the family she had lost and the family she had found a shield against the violence born of their shared tragedy. The storm broke as suddenly as it had begun. The wind died down to a mournful whisper, and a pale, watery sunlight filtered through the dust-choked air, illuminating a scene of devastation. Simon's remaining men had fled when they saw their leader fall, not to a bullet, but to his own shattered past. He was captured, his fight gone, leaving him a hollowed-out man slumped against the wall, the weight of his tragic mistake crushing him. In the aftermath, a profound quiet settled over the ranch. Jackson, his face grim and smudged with gunpowder, bound Simon's wrists. Eliza moved through the wreckage, her actions methodical. She tended to a shallow graze on Jackson's arm, her touch gentle but sure. Together, they surveyed the damage, the shattered windows, the bullet-scarred walls. The home they had built was wounded, but it was still standing. Later that evening, after the federal marshal had come and gone, taking a silent, broken Simon with him, Jackson and Eliza sat on the porch. The air was clean, now washed by the storm. Molly was asleep inside, blissfully unaware of the ghosts that had battled for her future. For a long time, neither of them spoke. There were no more secrets between them, only a vast, shared history of pain and survival. "I'm sorry," Eliza Jackson finally said, his voice low. "For your brother, for all of it." She looked out at the darkening plains, the lavender patch a blur of purple in the twilight. "I don't know who to grieve for," she confessed, her voice thick with unshed tears. "The boy I remember, or the man he became because he thought I was gone?" She took a deep, shaky breath. "He spent his life trying to avenge my death, and I spent mine trying to survive his betrayal. We were both chasing ghosts." Just then, another carriage appeared on the horizon. It was Clara's. She had seen the dust storm from town and had come to check on her investment. She stepped out of the carriage and took in the scene, the bullet holes Jackson's bandaged arm, and the profound, unbreakable stillness between him and Eliza. She saw not a rancher and his hired help, but two survivors bound by something far deeper than land or money. She walked up to the porch, her silk dress looking absurdly out of place. "Jackson," she began, but her voice faltered. She looked from his weary face to Eliza's steady gaze. She understood. She could not compete with this. Her offers were of wealth and society, but these two had forged something far more valuable in the crucible of violence and loss. "The railroad will find another route," she said quietly. It was not a defeat, but a concession to a force she could not overcome. She nodded once, a gesture of respect, and turned and walked back to her carriage, leaving them alone with the quiet dignity of their shared world. In her leaving, a final thread was tied. Jackson and Eliza's connection was not one of convenience or pity or circumstance. It was a bond forged in fire, tested by violence, and solidified in the quiet understanding that they had both in their own ways finally come home. Several months later, the scars on the ranch had begun to heal. New glass filled the windows, fresh timber patched the walls, and the lavender, resilient and determined, was in full bloom again. It sent a fragrant promise of peace. Life had found its new normal, a quiet rhythm of shared chores, easy silences, and Molly's bright, infectious laughter. One crisp autumn morning, Jackson hitched the wagon and helped Eliza onto the seat. He didn't say where they were going, and she didn't ask. They rode into Dry Creek, the town that had once judged her, and stopped not at the general store, but at the small clapboard building that housed the Territorial Land Office. Inside, the air was stale with the smell of old paper. Jackson spoke quietly with the clerk, then spread a familiar crackled deed on the counter. The Crane Homestead. With a steady hand, he dipped a pen in the inkwell and signed his name officially, transferring the title of the land to its rightful heir. He slid the document across the polished wood to her. Her name was written in fresh, dark ink, Eliza Jean Crane. Her fingers trembled as she traced the letters. Tears welled in her eyes, not of sorrow, but of profound, overwhelming release. This was not a romantic gesture. It was an act of justice. It was a restoration. He wasn't giving her a gift. He was returning her legacy. He was giving her back her name, her history, and the very ground beneath her feet. The final scene of their long journey unfolded back at the ranch under a sky painted in the soft hues of sunset. Eliza was in her garden on her knees, in the dirt that was now legally, spiritually, and wholly hers. She was planting new lavender, just as her mother once had her hands moving with a deep ancestral memory. Molly was beside her, carefully placing the small plants into the holes. Eliza dug her small face, serious with the importance of the task. Jackson watched them from the porch, leaning against the post that had been scarred by a bullet. He reached into his pocket and pulled out two objects. One was the silver locket Silas Simon had dropped during the final confrontation, its surface now polished, Sarah's smile safe inside. The other was the wooden heart Molly had carved for him, rough and imperfect, and more precious than gold. He was no longer a man defined solely by his grief, a ghost haunting the ruins of his past. And Eliza was no longer a woman defined by her chains, a survivor fleeing her history. She was a landowner, a mother, a partner. She was home. She looked up from her work, and her eyes met Jackson's across the yard. A slow, quiet smile spread across her face, a smile of peace and belonging. He smiled back. Molly, seeing them, beamed and waved with a dirt-caked hand. They stood there for a long moment as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting their long shadows across the land. A man, a woman, and a child. A family whole and unbroken, looking out at the endless promise of their future together.